I think everyone was a bit wrung out after the morning session. So, item 11. And I'd just like to invite our staff who are presenting, Mace and Rachel and team. And Mace, I just wondered, did you want to introduce the item and kick it off, and then introduce the group presenting with you?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, the purpose of the report, Madam Chair and councillors, members, is to seek your endorsement of an approach to pest management in Kohokounui, Hunua Ranges Regional Parklands. Today I have, who will be doing the key presentation, Miss Rachel Kelleher, Manager of Regional Parks, and we have with us Thelma Wilson too from the Department of Conservation, who are a partner in terms of this proposed landscape scale pest management. We are expecting, Madam Chair, if he can get here, also Hauru Rarui from Ngāti Poa, but he's...
Yeah, just before, I think.
Yeah. He was.
Okay. He was around. Yep.
He had a hui with panuku, so we hope he's able to return.
Excellent.
So I think I know it's been a long meeting, Madam Chair, if we head into the presentation, but really the purpose of the report is to seek endorsement for a 2018 management program in the Hunua Ranges, including Hunua, Whakatiwai and Wahiro regional parks, generally referred to in the presentation as Kohokounui, amounting to some 17,000 hectares of our own parkland and potentially extending into the land managed by and administered by the Department of Conservation in the north and to the south of the Hunua Ranges, and also private land. So the important point is in this proposal is undertaking a landscape scale pest management operation, but I'll hand it over to Ms. Kelleher to make the presentation.
Thank you, everybody. So I'm just going to start off very quickly with our first slide, which is just a reminder about some of the important values that we're seeking to protect at Kohokounui in the Hunua Ranges through pest control. So there's been a long program of pest control in the range, established in the early 90s, primarily around protecting kōkako as part of a program led by Auckland Regional Council. And that's been a resounding success, bringing that one remaining mainland population of kōkako back from the brink, where we had a situation of 5 pairs, which we later found were only one of those 5 pairs was actually a female and a male pair. So we've done a sterling job in bringing those back from close to extinction at that local place. It's also a site for a huge range of important ecological values, important ecosystems, but also habitat to a range of other threatened species, including long-tailed bat, kaka, we have hockshedders frogs, and a whole range of other forest birds. So it's a very important site. The Regional Parks Management Plan recognises those ecological values and the importance of it as a cultural place to mana whenua, and through that plan we identify the importance of protecting those values. So back in October 2014, the Regional Strategy and Policy Committee passed a resolution to approve a change in pest management methodology for the Hunua Ranges to enable the use of aerial application of 1080, and that was to start in the winter of 2015. Pest management in Hunua is part of an ongoing program of work carried out through the Biosecurity Group and Council, and typically the annual program of work is carried out without too much discussion at this level, but because this program is unique in its scale but also in the methodology being used, we're bringing it to you for your consideration. We also know that it's a subject that engenders a range of public interest. So I'm just going to recap the reasons for changing the methodology back in 2015, and those reasons still stand today. And they are largely that possums, rats and stoats also ferrets, other mustelid species, pose a serious threat to those ecosystems and species within the Hunua ranges that we're seeking to protect. 1080 is one of the tools that effectively targets the main predators of our important indigenous species. The actual and perceived risks are able to be managed through nationally recognised standards and accepted best practice, and that's informed by over 60 years of use of this pest control method, and a huge amount of research that's gone into looking at the safety and the efficacy of this toxin. It's cost effective and able to tackle pests at that landscape scale, as mentioned earlier. And an important consideration for us in looking at what type of method we use in the Hunua ranges has been around ensuring that we don't increase the chance of introducing Kauri dieback disease into one of these important coda areas where the dieback disease is currently not present. So that's had a heavy bearing in our consideration. And I think one of the other things that I'll just mention, it's not up on that slide, but it also enables us to shift away from using other toxins that are known to accumulate in the environment. So there was a mention earlier in the public input session around a study into brodifacoum, and brodifacoum is one of those toxins that is known to bioaccumulate. The Department of Conservation has moved away from using that a lot on conservation estate, and equally in some of our areas we're wanting to shift away from the use of that toxin and look at bringing other tools into the fore so that we can manage our pests in a range of different ways. So in 2015, the operation involved the treatment of around about 21,500 hectares, and that included about 17,000 hectares of regional parkland, about 1,700 hectares of Department of Conservation land, and I think worth noting, close to almost 3,000 hectares of private land. And one of the things about that particular operation is that there were more landowners that wanted to be involved than we could actually accommodate for that particular operation. We managed the operation through a range of different mitigation measures, some to deal with actual risk, but a lot of them also to deal with the perceived risk that exists out in the public. We had temporary park closures, we had a range of exclusion zones, particularly around the public drinking water reservoirs. There was a huge amount of monitoring that we undertook of water, of the species that we were seeking to protect, and also we looked at bait and carcass breakdown. There was a huge amount of information provided to the community and to park users, and I just made a note there, particularly around the work that we did with dog owners. So muzzles and emetics were provided to the owners of over 100 dogs. In fact, it was closer to 200 dogs. And we did an extensive amount of work with dog owners to provide dedicated fact sheets, specific tailored communication with adjoining park landowners, and went above and beyond which is considered to be sort of standard practice for the type of communication with dogs in this instance, because it is one of the known risks for these types of operations. There was also extensive audit carried out by ourselves, but the Auckland Regional Public Health Service, who looked at a whole raft of the different aspects of the operation, from things like the loading zone to our track clearance program to our consultation records. So the targets that were set for that operation and specified both in the long-term plan and also the parks management plan was to reduce possums to below 5% residual trap catch. That's the index that's used to measure possum density, and we also sought to reduce them to below 5%, rodent densities to below 5% in our intensively managed Kōkako management area. And you can see up there the results across the board were pretty spectacular actually, so well below the 5% target. We got less than 2.5% or 2.5%, 0.25% for possums in our first operational block, 1% in the second. And I think one of the most significant results there is the 0% that we saw in our Kōkako management area for rats immediately after the operation, but in 3 subsequent monitors. So that 0% density lasted for almost 6 months. In terms of the outcomes we achieved, there was over 300 water samples collected during the operation from both public reservoirs and also a range of streams and rivers that flowed from the operational area. It is the most extensive water sampling program that's ever been carried out for a 1080 operation in New Zealand. And from that substantial program, not one single sample detected 1080. And that included samples that were taken after heavy rain events within 4 to 6 hours of the work being complete, when you're most likely to detect something if it is present. In 2015 and 2016 breeding seasons for kokako, we had the back-to-back best ever fledging records from our monitored kokako pairs, and that compares with 0 chicks fledged from our monitored pairs in the preceding 2014-15 breeding season. We also had our first successful breeding of kokako outside of the intensively managed area, and we undertook a range of monitoring on other native species, including bats and our Hochstetter's frogs. The results from that showed that there was no negative impact on those populations, and in some instances they had improved in local areas. We haven't got to the point of being able to analyse our forest bird data to the extent that it will show a difference either way, but the anecdotal evidence from Dr. Tim Lovegrove, who's been leading the forest monitoring program for some years now, is that he's seen typically an increase in species like bellbird and kaka, and no significant decrease in other bird species. So of course there was a range of views expressed around the operation. We did get a small amount of concern raised with us by individuals during the course of the program, but equally we got a lot of positive feedback, so I've just provided you with some snippets up there of some feedback we received. The top 3 are from stakeholders and adjoining landowners, and the bottom one is from the Auckland Regional Public Health Service.
Sorry.
But what's important to note is that mainland pest management is ongoing. So in the absence of a fence or in the absence of an entire border of water, there is a requirement for us to continue undertaking pest management work. So monitoring that's been carried out by the Department of Conservation is indicating that next year will be favourable for pests. And our current monitoring of possums and rats within the Hanua ranges have shown that they've increased to levels where control is now recommended. A 3 to 4 yearly cycle is currently best practice when protecting for species values. Sometimes you can stretch it out a bit longer if you're only interested in protecting your forest canopy. And continued management in our kokako management area and also work with adjoining landowners doing ground-based work has continued. So this has not just been a case of us doing an aerial drop and then walking away. We've continued to do our intensive work in the kokako management area, and we're also working with landowners adjoining the parks to focus on particular hotspots that will create a source of reinvasion back into the parkland. So this graph here just shows you the current state and also the pre-operational monitoring data. So you can see there the monitoring that was carried out in February 2015 and then May. The colours haven't shown up quite as clearly as they had in the printed version, but rats are the left-hand side bars, so the darker blue bars, and then you've got possums, and then there's another bar there for possums as well, but that's using a slightly different monitoring method. So you can see there that after May 2015, when the operation was carried out, there was a substantive drop in both rats and possums, and then slowly over time, as we would expect, they've begun to creep back up again. When you look at the levels from April 17 for rats and you look at them back to May 2015, they look comparable in terms of the result that's showing. That's a little bit misleading in some respects because the index method that's used doesn't distinguish between an encounter of one species versus an encounter, say, of 20 or 15 or 10. So what we do know is back in May 2015, the tracking cards that were used were having multiple encounters, and in fact in some instances were almost unrecognisable as the cards that were set out because they were chewed to bits. The cards we're picking up now, we're having regular encounter, but it's typically with 1 or maybe 2 animals, so it's not quite the same result. So what we're proposing is to repeat the range-wide pest control using aerial applied 1080 in winter 2018. We are looking to add to that program ground-based control in the aerial buffers surrounding the reservoirs. So there were substantive setbacks around the reservoirs where no pest control work was carried out into the 2015 operation, and we know from our monitoring data that they've been a source of reinvasion back into the main core treated area. So we want to do some ground-based work to slow down that reinvasion and to get a bigger picture of total control across the park. We want to work with mana whenua and landowners to shift towards pest-free areas through expanded pest control, and we think there's potentially opportunities to do that by working alongside the Predator 2050 Trust, who have got an EOA process out at the moment, an expressions of interest process for councils and community organisations and mana whenua who are looking at carrying out landscape scale pest control. Just very quickly, it's difficult to say absolutely what the cost of the 2018 operation would be, because it is contingent on the final operational design and the requirements of the Ministry of Health, who has an approving role for these types of operations. But this work is funded from the Biosecurity Regional Possum Control Program. It's part of that annual envelope. The previous investment in ground control before we changed methods for possums only was about $358,000 per annum. And the indicative investment for treating the same area of parkland, or for treating the parkland at 17,000 hectares, is about $25 per hectare based on the costs of the 2015 operation. It's FTE neutral, so it's programmed work, and it will require the support of teams across council. And we would also be looking to work alongside partner agencies, so the Department of Conservation has adjoining land, and Waikato Regional Council, who have a jurisdictional interest in the Hanua Ranges, because slightly interesting site in that 2/3 of the Hanua Range actually sits within Waikato Regional Council's jurisdictional area. So in terms of where we're at the moment, we're very much in the stages of early engagement, starting some conversations to obtain views around the proposed plan. We've had discussions with mana whenua, in particular with Ngāi and Ngāti Whanonga and Ngāti Pawa, Ngāti Tamaoho, and we're committed to constructive and ongoing discussions around how we partner together to achieve the outcomes that we're looking to get. We've had some initial discussions with Watercare, also Waikato Regional Council, the Franklin Local Board, and of course with the Department of Conservation. And it's expected that those conversations obviously will continue following today's committee meeting. And that's it. Any questions?
Thank you, Rachel. We'll take a few questions and then we'll move. I know Councillor Cashmore, Deputy Mayor Cashmore, you're happy to move the
I'm happy to second.
recommendation.
Yeah, I'm happy to
and
second.
Councillor Cooper happy to second, so we'll, and I think you've got some names to recommend. So we'll take questions first. Councillor Casey.
The concerns about 1080 are many and varied, including by-kill, the water catchment, human health, soil and animals, particularly dogs. It's two of those I want to talk about because the two that came up this morning in the presentation at Public Forum, and one that's quite obviously missing from your report. Now, the presenter this morning talked about a number of species that were felled by the 1080 drop. Can you talk about the by-kill, because there's no mention of it in here, and relate to the allegation made this morning?
Yes, through the chair. So we undertook a range of monitoring of species through the operation, but the focus of that monitoring was very much on the species that we were seeking to protect. So we focused on indigenous species, so we've monitored kokako, hockshetter frogs, the bats, and we've got the general program of forest bird monitoring, which will pick up some of the introduced species as well. We didn't run a particular program focused on picking up introduced species that had basically succumbed through by-kill. But what we did do is we had, during the operational program after the application of bait, in some of those days preceding the operation, up to 70 staff out on the ground clearing tracks and walking over various parts of the park. They were instructed that if they encountered any indigenous species that were dead and on the ground, that they should recover those and bring those back. And we would have done further testing to confirm whether they had been killed as a result of consuming bait. For those days and the number of people that we had out on the ground, which was extensive, we did not encounter any dead indigenous species. We did encounter 2 dead magpies, and there were a small number of chaffinch that we also found during the trap clearance program. So we didn't specifically monitor for that, but we certainly were looking out for any Indigenous species that had potentially been impacted by the bait. So with reasonable confidence, based on what we were out there and seeing, certainly I'm not aware of any Indigenous species that were picked up as a result of bykill. And that's supported by a huge amount of research that's been carried out by a range of organisations that do these programs. Indigenous species tend not to be as susceptible to 1080 as some of the introduced species. It wasn't surprising that we did end up with a small number of chaffinch dead, for example, because they are grain feeders, so they will feed on a cereal bait, but that's unlike a lot of our native species that feed on other things.
Thanks for that answer. My second question relates to both communications and dogs, and I'll start with the sad fact that a dog did die. So this morning the presenter whose dog, he wasn't the owner of the dog, but the dog was on his property, said it picked up a dead possum from a nearby stream. So given the, according to your report, the extensive communications that we put out, how do we still lose a dog? And then I'll talk about the other 3 dogs that was allegedly may have been killed as a result of 1080.
So firstly, so as far as we're aware, only 1 dog was killed as a result of consuming a poison carcass. I'm not aware of the others that were mentioned by our speaker this morning. There was one other incident with another dog that did die post-operation, but that dog, we were unable to confirm whether it had died as a result of ingesting a bait or a poisoned carcass. The owners of that dog assured us that it had not been unsupervised and that the only place it had been under their direct supervision had been down at their river. And we sought some independent advice from a pathologist and a toxicologist who felt that the description around that particular dog didn't particularly align with secondary poisoning, but we couldn't rule that out because we, of course, didn't have the dog to be able to confirm one way or the other. So that's unconfirmed but unlikely. So we do know of the one that was referred to this morning. Based on the information we received from that dog's owner, that dog had been let out in the evening to go out and do its constitutional business. It wasn't under direct supervision at the time, and it appears that during that period where it was let out and unsupervised, it has gone and scavenged a carcass, potentially down at the river, as was mentioned by our earlier speaker, or potentially even further afield into the park. That owner had chosen not to take up the offer of muzzles and emetics, and that is their choice, of course, but that offer had been made available. And when I went back and looked at our records of communication with owners of dogs directly adjoining the park, we had over 23, I think, pieces of dedicated information where we'd specifically raised the risk that 1080 poses to dogs, as well as the risk of other toxins being used on private properties in that area, because we'd heard during our consultative process that other people had lost dogs because of pest control work their neighbours were doing, for example. And there was also one instance where someone had been doing some slug control in their garden and had lost their own dog. So, you know, there was good awareness out there from most people that they needed to be managing dogs. And I think the fact that we had close to 200 dogs that were provided with muzzles and emetics and staff that were available to go out and fit those muzzles for them. I know that one of our staff members who runs our conservation dog program went back to one dog owner about 4 times to get the right fit of a muzzle to make sure it was right for them. None of the dog owners with muzzles that were using them had any issues with their dogs during the operation. And, you know, that wasn't the only issue we had. We also found in the days immediately after the operation 5 dogs belonging to 2 separate dog owners roaming in the park. All of those dogs were apparently supposed to be under direct control of their owners, but their owners had somehow managed to let them escape their properties. One of the dogs had 2 puppies with her, and she was, as the crow flies, over 8 kilometres away from her property. So, you know, I think it's difficult to actually manage. I can't honestly say that we could have done much more, and I would put out there that for me personally, I'm an owner of 2 dogs, so I'm a dog person. I love dogs. and I knew it was a risk, and I wore that responsibility myself quite heavily, and certainly did my best to make sure that we were doing all we could to make sure people were going to keep their dogs safe.
You removed the signs the day
Thank you.
before, and it
Thank you, Rachel.
absolutely said it
Right,
was safe.
councillor Watson.
Tell the truth.
Councillor,
yeah,
excuse me, can we
yeah.
just have some order from the back, please?
Right.
You've had your say, Tricia, you've had your say, that's quite enough, thank you. I won't have our staff contradicted, that's not fair, and neither is it appropriate. Councillor Watson, that's quite enough, thank you, Tricia. Councillor Watson.
Thank you. And just following on from Councillor Casey there, the gentleman that spoke to us this morning referred to like loads of sacks of biokill. You're saying that wasn't the case? It was a very small number? Did I hear that correctly?
That's correct, and I'm certainly not aware of any staff removing anything in sacks from the operational area, anything.
Okay. The other one goes to the water supply, and again, I note the comment of the sampling showed no evidence of 1080, and this has 65% of Auckland's potable water. Again, and I may have mistaken the reference, but there was some comment about a dam being shut. That wasn't part of this operation. That was something else the people were talking about this morning, about water supply being affected. Have I got my wires crossed? That's what I heard with the submitters this morning.
Oh, okay, I didn't hear that reference myself, but it may have been he was referring to the fact that we did isolate the reservoirs during the operation, so no water was being drawn from those dams while the catchments for those dams were being treated until the full water testing regime had been complete and no 1080 was detected. Then they were returned back to supply. Yep.
So it was a precautionary,
It was very much a precautionary approach, yeah.
which we were briefed on extensively. Okay. Member Brown.
Kia ora. Thank you. Just a couple of things, really, just to help me join some dots together. Because if I looked at your graph on page 5 of your slide, the bottom slide, I mean, it's painfully obvious, as you've explained. But what is the explanation for the rebounding of the numbers? And then if you could premise that response on your other comment around 358, I think, K per annum for pest control. Was that last year? Because and then if I'm looking at that number, it tells me that we just spent that amount of money to endure a growth of 60% pest infestation from the earlier year. So I'm keen to know what the earlier year number was, given that I know last year's number, and I acknowledge your other comment around you don't know what next year's number's looking like.
Yeah.
So could I just have that answer? Have you got?
Through the chair, I'll do my best. So the first question was around reinvasion and why numbers have crept back up. I guess there's two reasons for that. The first is that this was the first whole of range operation that we'd carried out in over 20 years. So the previous work that we'd done, which I'll get to in the second part to your question, had only ever targeted about 5,000 to 6,000 hectares at a time, so it was never covering the entire range in one hit.
Okay.
So if that sort of gives you a little bit of an explanation. So we were dealing with basically, outside of the intensively managed areas, very, very high pest numbers. So I think the result that we got actually exceeded expectations in the sense that we were targeting 5%, but we got well below that. The other aspect to why we get reinvasion is the fact that we did have the buffers around the reservoirs, so we had between 50 and 80 metres, depending on topography, around the reservoir margins that was not treated. This time round we would hope to be able to have the time to get in there and do some ground-based control as well. But what we saw from the monitoring is that we did get reinvasion from those untreated areas, which you would expect because 50 to 80 metres over quite a large area does equate to quite a bit of habitat that's untreated. And the other part to it was, of course, in a mainland situation, in the absence of a fence, you do get reinvasion from outside the treatment area. So we've been working with landowners in some of the hotspot areas. So up in the northwest, the northeastern corners, we've been working with several of the adjoining park owners to do ground-based control to start bringing those hotspot areas down. And then your next question around budget. So that 358,000 per annum was what we were using for that roaming program of pest control that was achieving that 5,000 to 6,000 hectares of work annually. So what we've got here is, instead of spending that 358 on an annual basis to only achieve 5,000 to 7,000 hectares at a time or thereabouts, what we can do the whole of the range, so 17,000 hectares, for about 425,000.
Okay. I do want to acknowledge a couple of things in your report, because I do acknowledge that earlier Hauoru Rawiri was here from Ngāti Pāo, and he came to support the presentation, so made it clear to me as he departed that mana whenua, who you've noted in your comms, are engaged. There is an improvement. If we were to look at improvements of the last activity, and the first one I want to acknowledge was the previous Prime Minister and Right Honourable John Key. So unlike 2015, this year, Madam Chair, we have an overarching statement that says in 2050, this country will be pest-free. So with respect to the fatalities, I want to refer to how much I love kiwis. Because I'm a dog owner, but I actually won't let my dog near my kiwis. Hey? Because I don't trust my dog. I absolutely don't trust my dog. I love kiwis. So if the end point is the replenishment of these nationally endangered taonga, then with respect, it justifies the means. But what I want to draw to your attention from that statement of the early Prime Minister is that I think a role that we have as Māori within this community and this committee to play is beginning to encourage that terminology of eradication and getting away from the terminology of control and management, because that is an abyss and a bottomless pit that none of us, until the statement occurred, really knew where the end point was, which then leads me to my final encouragement, and that is, with all the funds, why on earth Auckland is waiting for the rest of the country to simply just get on with it around the commitment of turning Auckland into a pest-free environment in its entirety. So we're not excited about the methodology, as you know, but the end will justify the means. Now, unfortunately, from the last model, we had 6 taonga repatriated to Kohokohonui, of which we've lost half, including Te Whai, the one that our worship, the Mayor, named and released on that day. So clearly, notwithstanding this effort, we need to manage our over-enthusiasm around what truly belongs in a safe environment, and until then, until it's safe, a lesson that iwi have taken out is maybe not just yet. There are other environments and options within Auckland that lend itself more favourably towards the repatriation of taonga like kiwi and others, but really keen to start moving the language and terminologies into eradication and away from control and management. Kia ora.
Awesome. Thank you. Right, well, it's been moved and seconded, so is the mover
Couple of
Councillor
questions,
Cashmore?
Madam
Yeah.
Chair.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. First, I'd just acknowledge Member Brown for his leadership there in those statements. There was good questions and good words, James. Thank you very much. And your question about the graph movement was the first one I had. My second one, Rachel, is, and it goes to what Member Brown was saying about the kiwi. did we catch that miscreant ferret in the end of the day that killed those kiwi?
No, we haven't. We have done a lot of work since that rogue ferret entered the range and did that damage. We think that it was most likely a situation of opportunity where it's encountered a kiwi and then got that scent for it, and then unfortunately over the course of a week done a lot of damage. We've had someone in that does a lot of work managing ferrets to come in and give us advice, and they were hugely surprised actually that we had a ferret up in that area, as we were ourselves when we had this issue right from the outset, because ferrets have not typically been something that we've picked up through our extensive monitoring. But these are an animal that have large territories. It's the time of year when they can be moving around, and like I said, it was probably a case of opportunity where it had encountered something, liked what it encountered, and then kept on going, because of course kiwi do have quite a strong scent. We've looked with dogs, we've looked with the conservation dog, we've been up there, we've got a huge, we've got a trap network that's established focusing on those ferrets. We did kill one ferret while we were there, and again, it's like I said, it's the time that they're moving around. But it's quite possible, in fact, highly likely that it's just moved back out of the area. It wouldn't have come in and then come back out again once it's sort of lost that scent. What we did very quickly was to uplift the kiwi that were in the area to ensure that no further damage was done, and so those birds have been safely relocated back to where they came from for the time being, while we look at where we go from here. Lots of encouragement, lots of encouragement from the kiwi conservation groups, both from where the kiwi have come from, and also the Department of Conservation and the Kiwi Trust to keep on going. These sorts of things will happen from time to time, and unfortunately, in a mainland site without a fence are unavoidable.
I'll make note that in 40 years of tramping around the Hunuas, I've only ever seen one ferret, so I am concerned about that. The council received an award from the Prime Minister's environmental group about this program, this action. And that was about how this program was administered and monitored, both pre, during and after. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. We got the Local Government of New Zealand Excellence Award for Environmental Impact. So, and that looked at the whole range of aspects of the operation, and both the way in which it was carried out and the outcomes it achieved.
And if you're looking for the missing kaka that were mentioned this morning, they're all at the head of the Oriri Valley, because there's lots of tucker left back up there because of this program previously. If I may, Madam Chair, a very brief statement, and that is the Hunua Ranges is largely virgin forest. It's not regenerating, and as James knows, there was a bit of selective logging went on, but most of it is how it was for millennia. And it is very much a tonga for the south, for the city, if not for the country. We do not have kauri dieback, thank goodness. The country is wild, it's rugged. A comment was made this morning that it was, you could easily do this work by hand, but we've seen from the cost presentations here, that's horrendously expensive. And I'd suggest to you physically impossible in some aspects, particularly on the southeastern corners, which I know very, very well. It's torturous country. The tracking cards that Rachel mentioned, I saw the ones that were done pre-drop last time, 15. They weren't just footprints through the ink, they'd been shredded. It literally shredded, and I believe that this time we're not getting shredded cards, but just footprints. So that graph might be a little bit out of proportion, but that's yet to be seen too. And the other comment I'd have is the bird life is back into the Hunuas at a greater extent than what it has been before. It's not just the kaka, but it's the wood pigeon. It's all the native species that were there. There's always been bird life there, but there are multiple more now. And what I'm looking forward to, Rachel and Mace, you recall we had this debate in 2014, was it? And I talked about the red blanket of rata flower that shows up around the Hunuas in a belt. And I'm hoping we're going to see that again when we get spring in the Hunuas, if it ever stops raining. And that should be in the next 6 weeks. And you see all the rata flower, they go through a belt, and it's just a red vibrancy of natural beauty, and that is a sign of a healthy forest. So, Madam Chair, I'm very supportive of this program, obviously. We've put some names up there because I think there is the Franklin Local Board are strongly in support. Malcolm Bell used to live in Hunua. He lives in Beachlands now, but he was involved in the program last time. Councillor Sayers would be a great addition because of his rural background, and eventually in time, this sort of program on a different format, maybe with a different chemical, maybe spreading to other areas of Auckland. And of course, we have your deputy, Mr. Filiapaina, who was involved last time, knows the country, and has great leadership skills. So, and of course, an IMSB member or more would be very, very welcome, because we have some great kaumatua down that way to help lead this process through, as they did last time. It was much appreciated. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Very eloquent.
Madam Chair, may I just comment just briefly on it was suggested in our engagement with mana whenua that we would include a member from one of the 4 mana whenua groups in the Hunua Ranges as well, so I just wonder whether Councillor Cashmore might consider that.
Yep. I think that'd be highly appropriate,
Done.
Madam Chair. Yep.
It's in. Okay, and last word to Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, thank you for the presentation. I've been involved in pest management and conservation in the Hunua Ranges since 1993 as Chair of the Auckland Regional Council Regional Parks Committee, and initiated the ARC becoming involved in active management, conservation management for the kōkako, and the ARC, I believe, was the very first local government body to actually become involved in endangered species management. And the kōkako management area evolved from that, and there was a lot of hard work and a lot of dedication and indeed success. At that time there were 2 natural kōkako populations still in Auckland. The ones in the Waitakere Ranges had died out in the 60s, but there was a population at the north end of Great Barrier and one in the Hunuas, and the numbers were pretty much at the same level. Pretty soon after the regional parks, people stepped in the Hunuas. The Great Barrier population became effectively extinct. 2 birds were rescued and taken to Little Barrier, which that population, which may have been different 10,000 years separated from the mainland, was effectively lost. 1080 tends to be a very emotional subject in New Zealand. Further south in particular, DOC has come under a lot of criticism for using 1080 from not always well-informed members of the public, and in turn the defenders of 1080 tend to be somewhat defensive. There are problems with using 1080 in this mode, because as the presentation states, 1080 will kill possums, will kill rats, will kill mustelids, will kill feral cats, will kill a lot of stuff, as we've heard, in one big hit. But that can be misleading when it comes to the reality of ecosystems and nature. All of those animals that I've mentioned do not belong in New Zealand forest ecosystems, and they behave and react in different ways, so that a 1080 drop, just as we've seen here in the Hunuas, may reduce possum populations for 3, 4, 5 years. It may reduce rat populations, however, for maybe 6 months, and so on. And just as I predicted, the rat population, with the possums gone, the vegetation is more productive, the seeds, the flowers. And then what happens is you get competitor release. And so you've created a rat paradise. And one of the great talents of rats is their breeding success. So suddenly, not only are rats breeding very, very rapidly, but in a much more enhanced post-1080 environment with all the lush vegetation. And so you tend to get a disbalance, an over reach, if you like, of rats impacting on that ecosystem. And the more rats, the more damage to birds, to invertebrates, to lizards, whatever. And so that is one of the problems with 1080 as opposed to ground operations. What comes after that, with a plethora of rats, you have a huge attraction for mustelids. So in they come. And this is what apparently has happened in the Hunuas. If it has, this wouldn't be the first time. And I suspect putting kiwi into an environment like that turned out not to be that sensible. However, my concern is that we maintain the successful ground-based operation in the Hunuas, and one of the good things that apparently came out of the 1080 drop last time was a promise to extend the on-the-ground operation by 350 hectares to make it nearly 1,500 hectares, which is a significant part of the Hunua Ranges, and the part where there is obviously a lot of biodiversity signalled by the presence of kōkako. I'm concerned that if we go through the pain of using 1080, that at least we get some good science out of it. And I guess that defensiveness about using 1080 tends to make advocates overhype the benefits and downplay the negative aspects of it. So a council report is one thing, but the reality of nature is a lot more complicated. And I think we need to bear that in mind. I'm concerned then that we see, if we're going to, once you start this 1080, I guess, you're kind of locked into it. So if we're going to continue doing this every 3 years, with 1 good year and 2 increasingly bad year for the things that live up there, we continue on with our ground-based operation, which gives a permanent sanctuary for the wildlife, including the kōkako and everything else in that ecosystem. So I'm concerned, Madam Chair, that the whole idea of using 1080, I guess, has been justified because of its cost effectiveness, apparent cost effectiveness, compared to laborious ground operation. But I have no doubt at all that the ground operation is way more sustainable and justifiable in the long term. The report, as part of its promotion of Another Drop, talks about the successful kōkako breeding. But we all know that kōkako do not breed like battery hens on cue every year, like a lot of New Zealand birds. It all depends on environmental circumstances and the mysteries of nature. So if we're going to look at kōkako breeding success, let's be very clear that 1080 is not a bird aphrodisiac. Now, I think that needs to be explained a little bit more clearly. And I think in terms of talking about kiwi in the kōkako management area, that we bear in mind that dropping 1080 has unintended consequences in terms of differential predator and competitor reaction to that poison due to their innate biology. So, Madam Chair, I would like to see an amendment included in the recommendations that makes it very clear that the present kōkako management area ground operation will be maintained and extended as apparently it was promised at the last time. So that I would like to move accordingly, Madam Chair.
Okay. I think given our staff are signalling that that's entirely fine and fits with the program, I think we could just add that into the recommendations. Yep.
We're happy with that, Madam Chair.
Yep, we'll work on that. I've just got councillor Hills, and then we've got people who've been waiting since 9:30 this morning for us to get to their items. So let's round this up.
Oh, it's just a quick thank you. I know what is happening is massive. The birds are coming back, and I know that you were very personally hurt by the loss of kiwi, and that you were trying your best down there. And I know that in Glenfield now we're hearing reports of kaka in the neighbourhood, and I back onto reserve, and Tui and Kiruru are coming back in their huge numbers. And I think right across Auckland, the work you're all doing, as well as the volunteer groups and local boards and others, working together, is actually making a massive difference at a time we're growing population-wise. It's actually amazing to see the bird numbers, and I'll be looking forward to being able to celebrate that more. So thanks very much, and I know it's not always easy because of the things you have to bring forward to us, but I think it's making a real difference. So thank you.
Thank you, councillor Hills. That's appreciated. We know how much passion and commitment our staff and DOC put into this, and how personally they take the successes and failures. So we'll just wait for the wording. Why don't I put A through to E? I'll move that. All those in favour, please.
Division.
Oh, okay. Right, well, that gives us a bit of time. Always takes a bit of time. By division, A through to E.
Madam Chair, if I may, I think we certainly understand and hear the concerns, and the management and delivery of these programs is critical. I think the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment really made it very clear in her report that on careful analysis of quite extensive evidence, that not only should 1080 continue, including aerial operations to protect our forests to be used, but we should use more of it. She makes the statement that she's not prone to making strong statements like that, but it is currently the best tool. But and having said that, we are continuing to look at new technology and other tools so we can achieve that long-term goal that Member Brown alluded to of eradication and moving away from toxins. So.
That's great. Thank you, Mace. Okay. Oh, we've got all the words now. Agree that the management as part, agree that, that doesn't make sense. That is part of the wider pest management regime, the ground-based kōkako management area be maintained and gradually extended. So we'll put the whole thing through you, Madam Chair.
Why?
I want to vote separately on F.
Okay.
If it's possible,
Let's-
I'm happy with
While
the
we're
80 weeks.
massaging this, it's been agreed that we will by division. So let's go A through to E.
Madam Chair, sorry.
Sorry,
Just for
we are voting. Let's clarify quickly. Yep.
So you've only got IMSB member talking with my colleague
Yeah.
that would like my name inserted there as opposed to it just being a member.
We usually get growled for doing that because the IMSB has to sign it off. So you're happy? Okay.
And we'll take it to
Right,
the board.
Member Brown, you deal with the
Thank you.
fallout from that. A through to E by division. You'll have to call it, Tam. So we're only doing A to E.
Councillor Hulse,
Aye.
Member Brown,
Aye.
Councillor Casey,
No.
Councillor Cashmore,
Yes.
Councillor Cooper,
For councillor Clow.
Councillor Filipina,
Aye.
Councillor Hills,
Yes, please.
Councillor Mike Lee,
Aye.
Councillor Sayers,
Aye.
Councillor Stewart,
What?
Oh, yeah, sweet.
Councillor Wayne Walker,
No,
Councillor Watson,
Abstain.
Member Wilcox.
Yes.
2, 3.
What about me?
What about councillor
And
Clow?
councillor Clow.
It's supposed to be
We've got
before me
councillor
in the
Clow.
alphabet.
No, they want
Councillor Clove,
Yes.
came late. Councillor Michael Lee, yes, you did vote, yes.
Did.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Hey,
7,
did you ask me?
8, 9.
Did you get out? Sorry, did
I didn't get asked.
Oh,
We need to see the thing.
It's hard for Tam.
It's okay, it's okay.
we're
I
trying
think
to
it's
do
been its
two
past
things
anyway.
at once.
Okay, councillor Simpson, and my
Aye.
apologies.
I do apologise, we're trying to sort out the wording for the next recommendation and do the division at the same time. Would have probably been just easier to have asked people who wish their votes recorded.
Left you and I off, Ross.
How are we doing, Tam?
12 votes for, 2 votes no, 1 abstention.
That sounds pretty good, so it's carried, and we'll go to F, which is making sense now, agree that management, still agree that part of the wider pest management regime, the ground-based kōkako management area be maintained and gradually extended. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. Awesome. Thank you, team. We got there in the end. It's appreciated. Item 12. So we've got the Western Isthmus Water Quality Improvement Program, and then we've got smoke-free, Tiarai, Glengarry, Taniwha, and then the confidential items. So they are big items in themselves, but hopefully we can constrain ourselves a little bit in our speaking. So